deltoid muscles are an extremely important part of the physique to develop. They can be seen from virtually every angle and every pose in bodybuilding. And no matter how impressive the rest of the physique is, you just can't hide leg and shoulders the way you might be able to some other body parts. And at the same time, well-developed, wide, round, and capped delts can significantly enhance any physique. Great shoulder development can hide many flaws and draw attention away from the underdeveloped pecs and arms. Needless to say, if there's one body part that should never be put on the back burner, it's the deltoids. The shoulders are made up of 3 heads: the front delts, the side delts, and the rear. And generally, most people tend to have underdeveloped side and rear delts. Personally, I've always had very large front delts, which have come from lots of heavy incline pressing and even flat presses. So any direct overhead pressing in my training is fairly limited. I use the energy and focus at the beginning of my workout to focus on what I need to bring up the most. And for me personally, that's the side delts. So lots of lateral raises to start off my shoulder training. I personally use an incline bench for lateral raises, which I set up just high enough to allow me to accomplish 2 things. First, brace myself so that there's no chance of me swinging my back or use my hips to generate momentum. This is something I see many people doing incorrectly. And when swinging the torso, it takes the tension off of the shoulders and allows momentum to move the weights from point A to point B. And the second thing that this angle allows me to do is to lean forward just enough so that my side delts are facing up at the top of the movement. If you stand too upright on a lateral raise, you may find that most people tend to tilt back a little bit at the top of the movement. This actually brings the front delts in to help lift the weights. But if you try this variation, you'll feel just how much harder it might be to perform lateral raises at this angle. Generally, these are done for higher volume sets, usually 5 sets of 10 to 15 reps, focusing on getting as much blood into the muscle as possible to start this workout. As I continue on with the session, I then move into the upright row. This exercise I perform with the easy bar, and the goal is to continue forcing as much blood into the side delts as possible. This movement has the added benefit of also hitting the traps very hard. And when doing higher reps, 15 to 20 for 4 to 5 sets, I can use volume as the driver for hypertrophy here and keep my reps a bit short of failure. This helps me keep all my reps clean and safe for the shoulder joint. And after performing this lift, the shoulders should be completely filled with blood to the point that it's painful to raise my arms. That's my goal early on in this session, as it helps me get more out of every lift that precedes this workout. Many people will focus on presses first, doing 2 to 3 different movements, maybe overhead pressing, then dumbbell presses, and then machine presses. They generally then finish off their workouts with just a few sets of lateral raises, and they also wonder why their side delts lack in comparison. I found that most people just go through the motions on side delts. This is especially due to the fatigue when placing them at the end of the workout. But if you flip that around and focus on forcing as much blood into the side delts as possible early on and racking up as much effective training volume for those muscle groups, you'll make much more quality progress over time and even get more out of every exercise after. Now, when I transition into the pressing exercises, I can get more out of lighter weights. And since the front delts are already getting hit very hard from my chest pressing days, any pressing I do on shoulder days, I try to milk as much side delt work out of it as possible. And when going into shoulder presses with pre-fatigued side delts, you make them more likely to be the limiting factor in your pressing strength, rather than only the front delts. Volume is not as much of an importance here, and I use this to my advantage with this exercise. Being that it's a compound movement, I can use it to take my shoulders much closer to failure, with approximately 1 rep left in the tank on most sets, doing 2 to 3 sets of 8 to 12 repetitions. This movement can easily be interchanged with a barbell press, which is a question I often get. And to be honest, it's just a personal preference. I personally like to perform both of these movements on a slight incline rather than completely upright. This has the added benefit of also hitting the upper pecs, and it was a favorite of Franco Columbu, who had a massive upper chest. I generally perform the dumbbell press more often than the barbell press, as the majority of my chest pressing is done with barbells. This makes for a more even ratio of dumbbell to barbell pressing, and this generally keeps my shoulder health and mobility in a good place. At this point in the workout, it should be fairly difficult to go super heavy, and due to the fatigue of the previous exercises, it should limit my strength output a bit, forcing me to lift lighter weights than I normally can when fresh. This is something that I was always against early on in training when I first started lifting, as I always associated heavier lifting with more muscle mass, which is true to an extent, but ultimately this comes down to strength progression when testing strength, meaning how much weight can you lift for how many reps when you're completely fresh. And what you're doing in a fatigued state or at the tail end of a workout is not necessarily a demonstration or test of strength. It's building that strength. So never get caught up in having to do a specific exercise in a specific order during your training. I've gotten great results doing isolations first and pressing later if there's a specific reason to do so. And in my case, that's to prioritize the side delts. If I was focused on the front delts, I'd be shoulder pressing first. Just always remember that during your training, your focus should be on building muscle and building strength. It doesn't always have to be a demonstration of it. And wrapping up the front and the side delt work, I generally finish off the shoulder workout with either trap work or rear delt work. Currently, I'm placing my rear delt work in a separate training session, and I'm placing my trap work with shoulders. This workout setup, I'm specifically hitting the traps very hard after performing upright rows, and shrugs are in place to finish off the traps for the day. I'll generally perform just 3 to 4 sets of shrugs here for 10 to 15 reps, as they're personally a muscle group that doesn't need a ton of attention from me. But one of the most important things for me to note here is my technique. I've been like many other guys in the gym who load up 4 plates on a barbell and barely shrug that with any range of motion. And when I've done that, all it ever did was place excessive stress on the lower back, wear and tear on the joints, and just beat up my body with little to no development. It wasn't until I started focusing on mind-muscle connection and lowering the weights did I then get more out of the movement. Regardless if it's a dumbbell or a barbell, I'll do 2 things. First, I'll focus on the deep stretch at the bottom. Once I think I've lowered the bar or dumbbells as low as I possibly can, I'll hang out in that stretch position and allow my traps and upper back to relax. This pulls the traps down even further for a greater range of motion. The stretch should almost be painful, but in a good way, if done correctly. Almost no one will ever feel that deep stretch performing shrugs the traditional way. Once in that position, I pull the traps up as high as possible, and once again, increase the range of motion. I do this by leading the movement with my elbows. This naturally forces a slight bend in the elbow at the top and allows me to pull the traps even higher than I could with a straight arm. The result is a pump you've never felt before when doing shrugs, but it also allows me to train safer by not having to load up on so much weight. But it's important to ease into this technique and assess your own shoulder mobility and health, but also be careful of the biceps. You don't want to perform any explosive movements here. And even though this can be considered loose form, it's very important to keep each rep under control. This entire shoulder workout can be done on its own day if it's a weak point, and more volume and more exercises can be added to it. This is personally my setup based on my own physique goals, and I pair it with biceps and triceps at the end of the session. The transition from shoulders to arms works really well for me, as I can hit just a few exercises for those body parts, as they're a strong point for me, and the entire session is still not extremely demanding. These principles should all be used to build your physique, but also to fit your goals and your personal needs. And if you want the program that I recommend to build your physique, using proven old school bodybuilding training methods, I highly recommend you check out my 5-day old school mass gain program in the description below. And as always, if you want to see more of the best original bodybuilding content just like this, make sure to hit subscribe.